The wind howled through the trees as Elliot sat alone in his dimly lit cabin. It was late, and the world outside felt eerily quiet. Too quiet for a man who had spent years seeking solitude. His small wooden home, nestled deep in the woods, was supposed to be his escape from everything. From noise, from people, from life itself. But tonight, something felt different. Elliot glanced up from the book he'd been half reading when a sharp knock echoed through the room. Startled, he froze. No one ever visited him here. Not friends, not family. Not even the mailman dared to trek this far into the wilderness. He set the book down on the table, stood slowly, and moved toward the door. Another knock came, louder this time, more insistent. Gripping the edge of the curtain, he peeked outside. Standing on his porch was a woman unlike any he'd ever seen. Her skin shimmered faintly under the moonlight, almost glowing as though it held its own light. Her eyes were large and otherworldly, reflecting colors that seemed to shift like an oil slick. She wore a flowing garment that looked like liquid silver, catching every stray beam of light and scattering it into tiny rainbows. For a moment, Elliot thought he might be dreaming, or hallucinating. Either way, opening the door felt like stepping into unknown territory. Still, curiosity got the better of him. Slowly, he turned the knob and pulled the door open just wide enough to see her clearly. "Who are you?" he asked, his voice steady despite the unease prickling at the back of his mind. "I am Lyra," she said, her voice soft, but carrying an undeniable weight. "And I have come back for you." Elliot blinked, taken aback. "Back? I don't know you." Her expression didn't change, but there was a flicker of sadness in her luminous eyes. "You do not remember me," she said, as if stating a fact rather than asking a question. "But we shared much. Once." Elliot frowned. This had to be some kind of prank or misunderstanding. Maybe someone sent her, a crazy ex-girlfriend looking for revenge, or a journalist trying to dig into his reclusive lifestyle. Whatever it was, he wasn't interested. "I think you've got the wrong guy," he said firmly, starting to close the door. Lyra placed a hand against it, stopping him. Her touch was cool but not unpleasant. "Please," she said, urgency creeping into her tone. "There is no time for disbelief. You must listen to me. Earth is in danger, and only you can help stop it." Elliot stared at her, incredulous. Danger. Him. The idea was laughable. He was nobody special, just a scientist who preferred books and telescopes over people. Yet, as ridiculous as her words sounded, there was something about her presence that made his chest tighten. Something familiar, though he couldn't place it. Before he could respond, she leaned closer, lowering her voice. "Do you dream of stars, Elliot? Of places beyond this world?" His breath caught. How did she know about his dreams? Nights where he wandered vast alien landscapes, spoke languages he didn't recognize, stood beside someone whose face always remained blurred. I don't understand," he stammered finally. "You will," she promised. "But first, let me inside. We are running out of time." Elliot hesitated, torn between logic and instinct. Finally, with a sigh, he opened the door wider. "Fine. Come in. But if this is some kind of trick—" "It is not," Lyra interrupted softly, stepping past him. As she entered, the air around them seemed to hum faintly, as though charged with electricity. For the first time in years, Elliot felt truly awake and utterly terrified. Whatever was happening, it was only beginning. The moment Lyra stepped inside, the atmosphere in Elliot's cabin shifted. The usual quiet hum of solitude was replaced by an unexplainable tension, as though the air itself had become heavier. She moved gracefully, her shimmering form casting faint glimmers across the walls. Elliot watched her warily, unsure whether to trust his instincts or dismiss her outright. "Sit," she said softly, gesturing toward the worn couch near the fireplace. Her voice carried a quiet authority that made it hard for him to argue. Reluctantly, he obeyed, keeping a cautious distance between them. Lyra settled into a chair opposite him, her piercing gaze never leaving his face. "You do not remember me," she began again, her tone calm, but tinged with sadness. "But we were once close, closer than you can imagine." Elliot crossed his arms over his chest, defensive. "Look, I don't know what you're trying to pull here, but I've never met you before tonight. If this is some kind of scam—" "It is not a scam," she interrupted gently. "What I say may sound impossible, but it is true. You and I, we are from another place, another time." Elliot stared at her, dumbfounded. "Another place? Like where?" "A planet called Valerian," she replied without hesitation. "It lies far beyond your stars, in a galaxy few humans have ever seen." He snorted, shaking his head. "Right. Aliens, of course." Lyra didn't react to his sarcasm. Instead, she leaned forward slightly, her luminous eyes locking onto his. "Think back, Elliot. Have you never wondered why you feel so out of place on Earth? Why your dreams take you to places you cannot name, yet feel familiar?" Her words struck a chord deep within him, though he tried to ignore it. For years, he'd dismissed those dreams as random nonsense, his subconscious piecing together fragments of books he'd read or movies he'd watched. But now, hearing her speak, doubt crept in. How did she know about the dreams? "I'm listening," he muttered finally, curiosity getting the better of him. "Go on." Lyra nodded, as if expecting this reaction. "Valerian was home to my people, the Vayari, and others who came from distant worlds. Among them was you, Elliot, or rather, the version of yourself who lived among us. Together we traveled across galaxies, explored wonders beyond comprehension, and fought to protect those unable to defend themselves." Elliot frowned, leaning back against the couch. "That sounds like science fiction. And even if it were real, which I'm not saying it is, why wouldn't I remember any of it?" Pain flickered across Lyra's face, brief but unmistakable. "Because your memories were taken from you. After a mission gone wrong, you sacrificed everything to save our people. To protect you, we erased your past, sending you back to Earth with no recollection of who you truly were." Elliot opened his mouth to protest, but before he could speak, Lyra reached out and placed her hand lightly on his forehead. A sudden rush of images flooded his mind, so vivid they felt real. He saw himself standing beneath twin suns, their golden light bathing alien landscapes. He heard voices speaking in languages he couldn't understand but somehow knew. Most strikingly, he saw Lyra beside him, smiling as they walked through fields of crystalline flowers. And then, just as quickly as they appeared, the visions vanished. Elliot gasped, pulling away from her touch. His heart raced, and his hands trembled. What was that?" he demanded, his voice shaking. "A glimpse of your truth," Lyra whispered. "But there is more you must learn. Much more." Elliot sat there, stunned, struggling to process what had just happened. Was it possible? Could he really be someone else entirely, a person from another world? The idea seemed absurd, yet the memories lingered, refusing to fade. Whatever Lyra was hiding, it was clear she wasn't lying. Not completely. And that thought terrified him. Elliot sat in stunned silence, his mind racing as he tried to make sense of what Lyra had shown him. The images were vivid, too vivid to dismiss as mere tricks or illusions. Yet the idea that he was once part of an alien civilization felt impossible, like a story ripped from one of the sci-fi novels he used to read as a child. Still, the weight of Lyra's words pressed heavily on him, gnawing at the edges of his skepticism. "Why now?" he asked finally, breaking the silence. His voice was low but firm, betraying both confusion and frustration. "If all this is true, if I really am, whatever you say I am, why are you telling me now? Why come back after all these years?" Lyra hesitated, her glowing eyes clouded with something akin to regret. "Because Earth is in danger," she said simply. "And without you, there may be no way to stop it." Elliot frowned, leaning forward. "Danger? From what? Aliens invading? Is that what you're saying? She shook her head. Not invaders, exactly. There is a faction among my people, the Obscura. They seek power above all else, willing to destroy entire worlds to achieve their goals. Long ago, they were cast out, but now they have grown stronger. Their target is Earth. Elliot stared at her, disbelief creeping back in. Earth? Why would anyone care about Earth? We're just us, a tiny planet in the middle of nowhere. You underestimate your world, Lyra replied softly. Earth holds immense potential, energy sources buried deep within its core that could sustain civilizations for millennia. The Obscura knows this. If they succeed, they will drain your planet dry, leaving nothing behind but ash and darkness. The gravity of her words hit Elliot like a punch to the gut. Despite his doubts, the conviction in her voice made it hard to ignore her warning. He ran a hand through his hair, exhaling sharply. Even if I believe you, which I'm not saying I do, what could I possibly do about it? I'm just me, a guy who spends most days staring at stars through a telescope. Lyra smiled faintly, though there was sadness in her expression. You are more than you know, Elliot. Once you stood as a guardian, a protector of worlds. That spirit still lives within you, even if your memories do not. Before Elliot could respond, Lyra stood and walked toward the center of the room. She raised her hands, palms facing upward, and closed her eyes. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the air around her began to shimmer, as though heat waves were rippling off her skin. A soft hum filled the cabin, growing louder until it vibrated in Elliot's chest. To his astonishment, objects in the room started to move. Books floated off shelves, hovering midair. The fire in the hearth roared to life, flames dancing wildly before settling into a steady glow. Even the potted plant on the windowsill seemed to perk up, its wilting leaves turning vibrant green again. Elliot gaped at her, unable to form words. Whatever she wasn't human. And if she could do this, what else was possible? I am not asking you to believe everything right away, Lyra said, lowering her hands. The objects settled back into place, and the hum faded. But know this, the Obscura is already here, watching, waiting. You cannot afford to remain blind to the truth. As if on cue, a sharp noise outside startled them both. Elliot turned toward the window, his heart pounding. Through the glass, he saw movement, dark shapes darting between the trees. Shadows flickered unnaturally, as though alive. What is that? He whispered, fear creeping into his voice. Lyra's expression hardened. They found us. Without another word, she grabbed Elliot's arm and pulled him toward the door. We need to leave. Now. Elliot hesitated only for a moment before following her. Whatever was out there, it was clear one thing was certain. His quiet, ordinary life was over. The night air was cold and biting as Lyra dragged Elliot out of the cabin, their footsteps crunching against the frost-covered ground. Behind them, the shadows moved closer, unnatural shapes that seemed to twist and writhe like living smoke. Elliot's breath came in ragged gasps as he glanced over his shoulder, his heart pounding with fear. What are those things? He demanded, his voice trembling. And how do they even know where we are? They're scouts, Lyra replied tersely, her grip tightening on his arm. Sent by the Obscura to track us. They won't stop until they find what they're looking for, or destroy everything in their path. Elliot wanted to argue, to demand answers, but there was no time. The shadows were gaining speed, spreading across the forest floor like spilled ink. Lyra led him toward a narrow dirt trail barely visible in the moonlight, her movements quick and deliberate. She seemed to know exactly where she was going, which only added to Elliot's growing unease. After several minutes of running, they reached a rocky outcrop partially hidden by thick underbrush. Lyra stopped abruptly, pressing a hand against the stone wall. To Elliot's astonishment, the surface shimmered faintly before sliding open with a soft hum, revealing a dark passageway beyond. "Get inside," she urged, pushing him forward. Elliot hesitated, staring into the abyss. "Where does this lead?" "A safe place, for now," Lyra said firmly. "Trust me." With the unnatural shadows closing in behind them, Elliot didn't have much choice. He stepped through the opening, followed closely by Lyra, who sealed the entrance behind them with another touch. The passageway lit up instantly, glowing veins of blue energy pulsing along the walls like veins in a living organism. As they descended deeper underground, Elliot couldn't shake the feeling that he'd been here before. The sensation gnawed at him, mingling with the adrenaline coursing through his veins. When they finally emerged into a large cavern filled with strange machinery and glowing artifacts, he froze. This is real," he whispered, taking in the sight around him. Alien technology lined the walls, devices humming softly, screens displaying symbols he somehow recognized despite never having seen them before. In the center of the room stood a massive crystalline structure, its surface refracting light into dazzling patterns. Lyra walked ahead, placing a hand on the crystal. "This facility belonged to the Veyari," she explained. "It served as a hub for monitoring Earth and protecting it from threats. You were stationed here once." Elliot shook his head, overwhelmed. "How can I remember something like this? It doesn't make sense." "It will," Lyra promised. She gestured toward a table nearby, where ancient-looking objects lay scattered. One of them caught Elliot's eye, a small, intricately carved pendant shaped like a starburst. As he picked it up, flashes of memory surged through him again. Standing beside Lyra in this very room, holding the same pendant as they discussed their next mission. "You see," Lyra said gently, "the truth has always been within you. It just needs time to resurface." Before Elliot could respond, an alarm blared through the cavern, red lights flashing urgently. Lyra's expression turned grim. "They found us." Moments later, the ceiling above them cracked open, revealing the shadowy forms of the Obscurer's drones descending rapidly. Lyra grabbed Elliot's arm once more, pulling him toward a hidden exit. "We need to go, now." As they fled, Elliot realized one thing with chilling clarity. The Obscura wasn't just after Earth. They were after him. And if he didn't figure out why soon, it might already be too late. The escape from the underground facility left Elliot breathless and shaken. Lyra had led him through a labyrinth of tunnels, her movements swift and precise, as though she'd memorized every twist and turn. Behind them, the sound of collapsing rock and distant explosions echoed, a grim reminder of how close they'd come to being trapped, or worse. When they finally emerged into the cold night air, Elliot collapsed onto the damp forest floor, his chest heaving. "What was that?" he panted, staring up at the stars that seemed impossibly distant now. "That was the Obscura," Lyra replied, crouching beside him. Her voice was calm, but there was an edge to it, a mix of anger and urgency. "They won't stop until they've taken everything, including you." Elliot sat up slowly, his mind racing. "Why me? What do they want with me?" Lyra hesitated, her luminous eyes searching his face. "Because you were one of us once. A guardian. Someone who stood against them. They fear what you could become if your memories return fully." Her words sent a chill down Elliot's spine. He wanted to argue, to deny it all, but the flashes of memory, the dreams, the pendant, the visions, kept surfacing, impossible to ignore. Whatever he had been, it was clear he wasn't just some random human anymore. "We don't have time to waste," Lyra continued, standing and offering him a hand. "If you're going to survive this, you need to awaken the abilities within you, the ones they try to erase." Elliot frowned, taking her hand reluctantly. "Abilities? You mean, like what you did back in the cabin? Moving things with your mind?" "And more," she said firmly. "You were powerful, Elliot, stronger than most. But those skills won't come back on their own. You'll need to train, to remember." Over the next few days, Lyra pushed Elliot harder than he'd ever imagined possible. They found refuge in another secluded location, a cave hidden deep in the mountains, and began a rigorous process of awakening his latent powers. At first, nothing seemed to work. When Lyra instructed him to focus on lifting a small rock, all he managed was a headache. "Clear your mind," she urged patiently, sitting cross-legged beside him. "Feel the energy around you. It's already there. You just need to tap into it." Elliot gritted his teeth, frustration bubbling inside him. "I'm trying, but I don't feel anything." "You're overthinking it," Lyra said gently. "Stop doubting yourself. Trust the part of you that knows this is real." Her words struck a chord. Closing his eyes, Elliot took a deep breath and let go of his skepticism. Slowly, faintly, he began to sense something, a warmth spreading through his body, like sunlight breaking through clouds. He focused on that feeling, directing it toward the rock. To his amazement, the rock wobbled slightly before rising into the air. Elliot gasped, opening his eyes to see it hovering inches above the ground. I did it," he stammered, disbelief giving way to awe. Lyra smiled, pride flickering across her face. "That's just the beginning." As the days passed, Elliot grew stronger. He learned to manipulate energy fields, creating barriers to block attacks. He discovered he could move faster than ever before, his reflexes sharpening beyond human limits. Each new ability brought flashes of memory, images of battles fought alongside Lyra, moments of triumph and pain. But not all memories were welcome. One evening, during meditation, Elliot saw something that made his blood run cold. Himself standing among the Obscura, wearing their dark armor. Their leader, a shadowy figure named Draxus, spoke to him, praising his loyalty. "No," Elliot whispered, snapping out of the vision. His hands trembled as he looked at Lyra. "Was I one of them?" For the first time, Lyra looked unsure. "You were, but not by choice. They twisted you, used you. That's why we erased your memories. To save you." The revelation hit Elliot like a punch to the gut. He realized then that his journey wasn't just about reclaiming his past, it was about finding redemption for the person he used to be. And the Obscura wouldn't rest until they dragged him back into the darkness. Elliot's training had transformed him. What started as clumsy attempts to lift rocks had evolved into a mastery of energy manipulation, speed, and heightened awareness. He could now feel the pulse of power coursing through his veins, a connection to something greater than himself. Yet, despite his progress, doubt lingered in his mind like a shadow he couldn't shake. Every time he closed his eyes, fragments of his forgotten past surfaced, haunting him with questions he wasn't sure he wanted answered. Lyra noticed the change in him. "You're ready," she said one evening as they sat by a small fire inside their mountain hideout. Her voice was soft but firm, carrying an unspoken weight. "The Obscura won't wait forever." Elliot nodded, though unease churned in his stomach. "What's the plan?" "We need allies," Lyra replied. "There are others, rogue Vayari, who refuse to align with the Obscura. If we can reach them, they might help us fight back." It sounded simple enough, but Elliot knew better. Trusting strangers, especially ones tied to his erased past, felt like walking blindfolded into a minefield. Still, he didn't have much choice. The Obscura was growing bolder, their drones appearing more frequently near their hiding spot. Time was running out. 2 days later, Lyra led Elliot to an abandoned observatory perched on a remote hilltop. It looked derelict from the outside, its windows cracked and walls overgrown with ivy. But as they entered, the interior revealed signs of life. Glowing panels embedded in the walls, alien symbols etched into the floor, and a group of figures gathered around a holographic map. "This is Kel," Lyra introduced, gesturing to a tall man with sharp features and piercing gray eyes. His presence was commanding, almost intimidating. "He leads this cell of resistance fighters." Cale studied Elliot for a long moment before speaking. "So this is him, the Lost Guardian." Elliot bristled at the term, but kept his tone neutral. "I guess that's me." "He doesn't look like much," another member muttered under their breath, earning a glare from Lyra. Ignoring the comment, Cale stepped closer. "If you're truly who Lyra says you are, then prove it. Show us what you can do." Reluctantly, Elliot raised his hand, focusing on a nearby chair. With a flick of his wrist, it levitated smoothly, spinning in midair before settling back down. Murmurs rippled through the group, some impressed, others skeptical. "Not bad," Cale admitted grudgingly. "But skill alone won't win this war. We'll see if you're worth the risk." For the next few days, the group provided shelter and supplies, sharing intel about the Obscura's movements. Elliot tried to integrate, but tension simmered beneath the surface. Cale's distrust was palpable, and several members openly questioned why they should risk everything for someone who barely remembered his own identity. Then came the betrayal. One night, as Elliot patrolled the perimeter, he overheard hushed voices coming from the observatory's main chamber. Peering inside, he saw Cale speaking urgently into a device, his face illuminated by its cold blue light. "Yes, I've confirmed it's him. Bring reinforcements. We'll take him alive." Elliot's heart sank. He'd been right to distrust them. Without hesitation, he rushed back to warn Lyra, only to find her already cornered by two Obscura agents. They held her captive, their weapons trained on her head. "Elliot," she cried, struggling against their grip. Rage surged through him, raw and uncontrollable. In that moment, something inside him snapped. A wave of energy erupted from his body, throwing the agents backward with explosive force. Before they could recover, Elliot grabbed Lyra's hand and bolted, leaving the traitorous resistance behind. As they fled into the darkness, Elliot realized one thing. He couldn't rely on anyone else anymore. From now on, the fight would be his, and his alone. The night was cold and unforgiving as Elliot and Lyra raced through the wilderness, their breaths visible in the frosty air. Behind them, the distant hum of Obscura drones grew louder, a relentless reminder that they were being hunted. Every step felt heavier than the last, but Elliot pushed forward, driven not just by fear, but by anger. Anger at Cal's betrayal, at the Obscura's cruelty, and at the life he'd been forced to leave behind. "We can't keep running forever," Lyra said between gasps, her voice strained. Despite her injuries from the earlier ambush, she refused to slow down. "They'll find us eventually." Elliot glanced back, his jaw tightening. "Then we make our stand now." Lyra stopped abruptly, grabbing his arm. "No, not here. If we're going to fight, it has to be on our terms. There's only one place where we might have a chance. Their orbital station." Elliot stared at her, incredulous. "Their fortress. Are you serious?" "It's heavily guarded, yes," Lyra admitted, her glowing eyes locking onto his. "But it's also where they control everything. Their operations, their weapons, their plans for Earth. If we destroy it, we cripple them." Elliot hesitated, weighing the risks. It sounded insane, a suicide mission. But deep down, he knew she was right. They couldn't win this fight by playing defense. This wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about stopping the Obscura once and for all. "Fine," he said finally, determination hardening his voice. "Tell me how we get there." Hours later, under the cover of darkness, Elliot and Lyra approached the outskirts of a massive launch site hidden within a crater. Towering structures loomed against the starlit sky, surrounded by energy shields and armed guards. Lyra explained that the Obscura used these sites to transport personnel and supplies to their orbital station, a colossal structure cloaked in shadow, invisible even to Earth's most advanced telescopes. Using his newfound abilities, Elliot disabled surveillance drones and created diversions, allowing them to slip past checkpoints undetected. Each moment felt like walking a tightrope, every sound making his heart race. But with Lyra guiding him, they'd reached the central platform where a sleek spacecraft awaited. Before they could board, A chilling voice echoed through the air. "You didn't think it would be that easy, did you?" From the shadows emerged Draxus, the leader of the Obscura. His presence was overwhelming, tall and imposing, clad in dark armor that seemed to absorb light itself. His eyes glowed faintly, filled with malice and triumph. "Elliot," Draxus continued, stepping closer. "Or should I call you Ironfall? The prodigal son returns." Elliot froze, the name striking a chord deep within him. Memories surge. Painful, fragmented images of himself standing beside Draxus, obeying orders, committing acts he couldn't bear to remember. "You don't belong with her," Draxus sneered, gesturing toward Lyra. "You were meant for greatness, for power. Join us again, and I'll forgive your betrayal." Elliot clenched his fists, fury burning inside him. "I'm nothing like you." Draxus smirked, raising a hand. Instantly, the ground beneath them trembled as reinforcements surrounded them. "We'll see about that." What followed was chaos. Energy blasts lit up the night as Elliot unleashed everything he had. Barriers to block attacks, waves of force to knock enemies off their feet, bursts of raw power that sent shockwaves rippling outward. Lyra fought alongside him, her movements graceful yet deadly, her shimmering form cutting through the fray like a blade. But Draxus was relentless. He moved with unnatural speed, countering Elliot's every move. When their powers collided, the impact sent both of them sprawling. Struggling to his feet, Elliot realized something crucial. Draxus wasn't just fighting him. He was testing him, probing for weaknesses, summoning every ounce of strength. Elliot focused inward, tapping into a well of energy he hadn't known existed. A brilliant aura erupted around him, blinding everyone nearby. With a roar, he unleashed a final devastating blast that sent Draxus crashing to the ground. Breathing heavily, Elliot turned to Lyra. "Let's finish this." Together, they boarded the spacecraft, leaving destruction and hope behind. The spacecraft roared to life, its engines humming with power as it ascended into the night sky. Elliot sat in the pilot's seat, his hands gripping the controls tightly, though Lyra guided him through the unfamiliar interface. Below them, the Obscura's launch site shrank into a distant glow, swallowed by the vastness of Earth's atmosphere. For the first time in days, or maybe even years, Elliot felt a flicker of hope. "Are you ready?" Lyra asked softly, her voice breaking the tense silence. She stood beside him, her luminous eyes fixed on the stars ahead. "As ready as I'll ever be." Elliot replied, his tone steady despite the storm of emotions raging inside him. He glanced at her briefly before focusing back on the horizon. "What happens when we get there?" Lyra hesitated, choosing her words carefully. "We disable their core, the source of their power. Without it, the station will collapse, and their operations across the galaxy will crumble." "And us?" Elliot pressed, his voice quieter now. "What happens to us?" Her expression softened, tinged with both sadness and resolve. "That depends on you, Elliot. Once this is over, you'll have a choice: to return to your old life or embrace who you truly are." Elliot didn't respond immediately. The weight of her words settled over him like a heavy blanket. Could he really go back to being just another man living in solitude after everything he'd experienced? Or was that part of his life already lost forever? When they reached the orbital station, the sight took Elliot's breath away. It loomed above them, a sprawling structure of metal and light, pulsating with energy like a living organism. Its surface shimmered faintly, cloaked in advanced technology designed to make it invisible to prying eyes. As they docked, Lyra turned to him one last time. "This is it," she said, placing a hand on his shoulder. "Whatever happens next, know that I'm proud of you, for fighting, for remembering, for choosing to stand against them." Elliot nodded, swallowing hard. Together, they stepped out of the ship and into the heart of the enemy's fortress. Inside, the station was eerily quiet, its corridors lined with glowing panels and alien symbols. They moved quickly, avoiding patrols and disabling security systems along the way. With each step closer to the core, Elliot could feel the oppressive energy of the Obscura pressing down on him. It was as if the station itself knew they were there. Finally, they reached the central chamber, a massive room dominated by a towering device radiating an intense blue light. The air crackled with electricity, and the hum of machinery filled the space. Elliot stared at it, awestruck by its sheer scale and power. "This is it," Lyra whispered. "Destroy this, and it's over." Before they could act, alarms blared throughout the station. Reinforcements poured into the chamber, surrounding them. At the center of the group stood Draxus, battered but far from defeated. His cold gaze locked onto Elliot. "You think you can stop me?" Draxus sneered. "You're nothing without us." With a roar, Elliot unleashed a torrent of energy, creating a barrier between them and the attackers. Working together, he and Lyra fought fiercely, their combined strength pushing back wave after wave of enemies. Finally, seizing a brief opening, Elliot focused all his power on the core. A deafening explosion rocked the station as the core imploded, sending shockwaves rippling outward. The walls began to collapse, debris raining down around them. Grabbing Lyra's hand, Elliot sprinted toward the exit, narrowly escaping as the fortress disintegrated behind them. Back on Earth, they watched the remains of the station burn up in the atmosphere like a falling star. Exhausted but alive, Elliot turned to Lyra. "So, what now?" he asked quietly. Lyra smiled, her eyes reflecting the dawn breaking over the horizon. "Now we rebuild. Together." And for the first time in what felt like eternity, Elliot believed her. Whatever lay ahead, he wouldn't face it alone.